Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. India is living out every nation's nightmare. A breathless surge in cases, question marks around the official death counts that are put out, and of course, a medical infrastructure that is completely crumbling from beds to ICUs to oxygen availability. How is the world looking at India at this point, even as some support begins to come in for India from different countries, whether it's the UK or the US or even China at this point? And what does this mean for India's standing globally, as also questions about whether or not the leadership has failed India at this crucial juncture? Joining me to talk about all of that is Michael Kugelman. He's Deputy Director of the Asia Program and the South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Michael, first for taking time out and speaking with me at this very difficult juncture that India is at right now. I want to understand how the world is viewing events as they're unfolding across India.
Well, I think that words that would oftentimes be seen as hyperbole, catastrophic, nightmarish. I mean, these are, I think, the words that, from the perspective of many of us abroad, that really match the situation in India right now. And especially for those of us in the United States, it's almost like deja vu, just because, we went through an incredibly difficult and tragic time last year. And you had cities like New York City that you had visuals very similar to what's happening in New Delhi, for example, now of, morgues overflowing with bodies and just a health infrastructure that's completely broken down. And I think that there's a recognition that this tragedy that India is going through now, it's clearly a tragedy for India, but it's also a tragedy and a big risk for the world, because obviously India is the second most populous country in the world. And, if it struggles to rein in this horrific surge of COVID, that could have major implications for the rest of the world too, including the United States.
That's the question I wanted to ask you, actually. Are people coming around to the view that India is now the global center of the pandemic? And is there also the fear, given India's own vulnerabilities, as you said, a crumbling health infrastructure, very large numbers, that this could tip over in a very dangerous way, not just for the subcontinent, but for the world at large?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And indeed, certainly India is the global epicenter of the pandemic, and it has been for quite some time. Once we started seeing the types of numbers that we've seen with the record-breaking number of new cases each day, and these death tolls going up, and it's widely viewed that the death toll in India is much higher than the official records suggest. So, there have been those observers that have noted, well, India is going through a terrible time right now, but at least the death rate is not high as it's been in countries like the United States. While that may be true on official levels, but who really knows the actual toll? So absolutely, India has become the ground zero for the most deadly pandemic that we've had in quite some time. And indeed, just looking at India's size and its location, and the way the world works now, even though to a considerable extent travel has been reduced, but there's still a lot of mobility in the world internationally. And, it doesn't take much for, the Indian variant or the variant that is widely believed to be responsible for this surge in India, for it to spread overseas. And, there have been several examples already, such as a case of an air flight that was going to Hong Kong from India, where a number of people were later found to test positive for COVID. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said before, this is not just a tragedy for India. It's a tragedy for the world, and overall it's a major risk for the world, which is why there needs to be, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, there needs to be a concerted global effort to bring assistance to India sooner rather than later, to prevent this surge from spinning more out of control than it already is. That is the need of the hour.
Yeah, of course, I do want to talk at length about how the world is reacting to this. But just to go back to that point about perception and how the world is seeing this, Michael, do you think it's shifted from the point where it is another country that's dealing with a huge outbreak of the pandemic, and it's gone into to the point where this is now looking like a full-scale humanitarian crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because there's been extensive media coverage, and the Indian media for sure, as well as the international media, have been there front and center. And I know this has been controversial for some in India. You have the cameras rolling in the emergency rooms. You have the cameras rolling at the crematorium sites, and so the world is seeing just how the extent of the suffering and the death, and certainly I think that shapes perceptions in a big way. And there have been so many countries over the last year plus that have experienced these horrific surges. I mean, obviously the United States went through it last year. Brazil has been going through a horrific surge as well. But I think that India, again, because of its size and the contributions it makes to the global economy, and really its status as an aspiring power, I think that really wakes the world up to the fact that this is really significant what India is going through now, just because everything that happens in India, and particularly this pandemic, which knows no borders, has major implications for the world on the whole.
Mm. There are two major lines of response from international media as one sees it, Michael. One, of course, is really bringing out the enormity of this tragedy that people are facing at a very personal level, at the level of a city or a state, and the other is a very, very sharp criticism of the leadership crisis. It's come out across the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Economist. Time pointed out that the Prime Minister's failure to lead is deepening India's COVID crisis. How do you see perception either changing or not changing around leadership, and what sort of conclusions are being drawn there?
Well, I think that you've hit it right on the mark there, that there are indeed two sharp perceptions, and one does revolve around the human cost for sure. And I think that's been the major focus of much of the coverage, as it should be. And indeed, there has also been a focus on the government's response or lack thereof, or poor response. And I think that makes sense. That's what one would expect, right? Because the first priority is to focus on the human toll, because the media, at the end of the day, particularly the global media, it wants to tell stories. That's what it's all about. It's not all that it's all about, but that's one of its major goals, is very human level. And there's no more tragic but essential story than the human cost of this pandemic in India right now. But at the same time, it follows on from that. Well, there's been this horrible human cost of this pandemic. Why is that? And so naturally, the attention will then turn to what brought us to the point that we're at now. And indeed, the media has focused, and pretty much on a critical level, for good reason, I think, on the government's response. And particularly in terms of it being slow to respond, even though it knew that you had this fairly contagious variant emerging and all of that. So I think that it makes perfect sense. I know that for many in India, that's not a welcome thing, and particularly for a government that it tends to be very sensitive to outside criticism. But again, this is what you get with India, a country that is so essential to the world, that's so large, that makes major contributions on the world stage on many different levels. So there's going to be a very keen interest from the international media in not only getting a better sense of what it means for people on the ground, for the Indian people, and particularly those suffering from the pandemic, but also what brought it to this point. How did it get this bad so suddenly? And particularly when you have what is clearly a case of a country that appeared to dodge a bullet last year, when the first surge certainly was rough, but you didn't see the level of tragedy that you see now. So that, I think, generates a very important and striking question for the media to investigate. How did things go from point A last year to point B this year? And naturally, that's going to focus on the government response.
What do you think the repercussions might be for the leader himself on a global stage, though, Michael? Because like you said, here's a leader who only a few months back was speaking at the World Economic Forum, talking about how India had very successfully dealt with any threat that was posed by COVID, and was a country really with front foot forward at this point. And now you have a situation where he is being pointed out to be perhaps one of the single largest reasons for the crisis and the way it's escalated, including widespread election rallies and perhaps an utter lack of planning.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true that the media coverage has been very focused on the suffering of of the Indian people and a lot of sympathy for them. But you don't have much media coverage that's going out of its way to praise Narendra Modi for his response or his government's response. And I think that, as you know, well before the pandemic began in India, there had been increasingly critical, negative media coverage, particularly from the West, focused on Modi, associating him with the democratic backsliding that India has experienced in recent years. And so I think that perceptions of Modi, which have sort of gone in many different directions. He's someone that, of course, was regarded as a pariah by many in the West, including the United States, for his alleged role in the Gujarat riots. But he reinvented himself. This is someone that I think has the ability to draw on some really powerful public relations tactics to shape his image. And he had a very good reputation. He changed his reputation for the better during his first few years as prime minister. But then as the democratic backsliding set in, perception started to change. And I think that for many of the international media corps right now, the response of Modi and his government, which I think one could certainly describe as slow, as complacent, and simply not being willing to recognize that the pandemic the pandemic was not defeated in India. And also the rampant politicization, trying to use the pandemic as a way to try to get votes for the BJP. All of this, I think, plays into existing perceptions that this is a prime minister that is not necessarily invested in, well, let me put it this way, not necessarily invested in meeting the needs of his people, all people, regardless of religion, whatever the case may be. And I think that's why you're not going to get much sympathy from the international media for Modi specifically and for his government. But again, the focus is above all on the Indian people. And I think that the media has been very careful not to essentially blame the Indian people. Certainly there has been some coverage of the failure to abide by social distancing, and particularly in terms of people not wearing masks and all that. I think there's also been a focus on the fact that this government should have done a better job of easing the risks, the public health risks of those bad social distancing decisions. There's been a lot of focus, for example, on how the government did not try to stop large election rallies or try to stop these large religious observances. So I think that's where the focus has been, trying to not necessarily shield the public from blame, but trying to make a point that, yes, you could talk about people not abiding by social distancing measures, but at the end of the day, the government needs to step in and ease the risks to the public from those poor decisions of society.
It's also been a period that's been marked by a somewhat uncomfortable dialogue between India and the United States, Michael, particularly with regards to relief or raw material. As you saw, there was a lot of back and forth. There was a point where the US administration said, well, America and Americans first. And then there's been a pivot, a slow pivot, albeit, from everyone in the US administration. What do you put that down to? Was that just hesitation to reach out and help? Or do you think it was dynamics between the two leaders that was affecting any sort of alacrity on the US's side to try and come out and help?
Yeah, well, the radio silence from the Biden administration during the first period of this horrific surge is, I think, very striking and very troubling. I think that strictly for reasons of public diplomacy, one would have expected the U.S. government on very high levels to issue statements of sympathy, solidarity, and that didn't come, even when you had the likes of Iran and China and even Pakistan issuing statements of solidarity, providing offers of assistance, that type of thing, and the U.S. was quiet. Look, I think there's been a lot of speculation as to why it took so long for the U.S. to go public in terms of its statements about India. I think that this was a case of the bureaucracy. I think that it was a mistake to wait and there was something to announce, so to speak, something concrete. So that's the mistake I think that the Biden administration made.
Do you expect there to be longer term repercussions on the relationship, Michael, because of everything that's gone down? Or do you think this will be treated as an emergency situation where it took a little bit of time for one side to react, but there was a reaction and let bygones be bygones?
Yeah, the relationship will be fine at the end of the day. There's been so much goodwill and trust built up over the last few decades that the relationship could withstand shocks, such as what's happened over the last few days. And also, you have really strong convergences of interest in the relationship, particularly those that revolve around concern about the rise of China. And I think, so the combination of longstanding goodwill and trust and convergent interest will ensure that the relationship will be just fine. Now, certainly I can understand why this radio silence from the U.S. would conjure up concerns among some in India that, the U.S. is not the dependable partner that it's meant to be. And I think that there is a tendency to look nostalgically at Russia and how it's been seen as the time-tested partner. And Russia has, of course, provided support with vaccines and offered more support. But the relationship will be fine. It could take some time, but now that we have the two governments speaking to each other, the U.S. is in the process of putting together an aid package. Once that's executed, once you have high-level discussions between the two sides, I would not be surprised if President Biden has a conversation with Prime Minister Modi soon. I think that will stabilize things. And at the end of the day, this is a setback to the relationship, but it's not going to leave a deep scar or anything like that.
It's interesting that you mentioned China, though, Michael, because we are getting aid from there as well. 800 oxygen concentrators have been sent, more hopefully, including from Pakistan. Humanitarian aid has come in from there. The aid is, of course, welcome for India at this very crucial stage. But do you think this puts India in a more vulnerable position in terms of where it stands in the geopolitics of this area?
Well, I think that the optics for the United States are not very good. The fact that you've had China and Russia and Iran offer up support or solidarity, sympathy to India. These are America's top rivals. That doesn't play well, I think, in Washington, which again is a reason why it was a mistake for the U.S. not to offer some type of messaging earlier on. But I think at the end of the day, India knows who its top partners are. China, despite its generous offers of support, China is a strategic rival, and it's going to remain that way. China is not going to change the types of policies that have driven so much concern in India about China and its intentions. And likewise, Russia is a longstanding friend of India's, but the trend lines of that relationship have been much less encouraging than the trend lines of the relationship with the U.S. That's not going to change. And certainly, Pakistan has offered humanitarian assistance, and there is some efforts to push some type of détente between India and Pakistan. But that's sort of playing out on a separate track. I do think that at the end of the day, like say 1 year from now, when hopefully the pandemic will be gone or much less serious than it is now, the U.S. will continue to be a top partner of India, and they will continue to figure out ways to work together to pursue their shared interests, mainly those revolving around China, and so on. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that you've had India's rivals and America's rivals stepping to the plate much sooner than the United States did in this case. But at the end of the day, I think just to make a very simple but essential point, for strategic reasons, it would have made more sense for the U.S. to get involved in this assistance plan with India earlier. But there's a moral imperative too. When you just going back to what we talked about earlier, the media images, the sights of the horrific levels of suffering and tragedy, it was a moral obligation on the part of the United States to provide assistance. Now, I know in international relations, we don't usually talk about morality. We talk about interest, cold hard interests. But given how bad the situation is in India, I think that it would have been better for the U.S. to act a bit more quickly, just because that was the right thing to do.
Mm. Up until now, and I know it's early days yet, Michael, responses have been piecemeal. You need an oxygen concentrator, let us send you that. Do you need more kits? Let us send you that. Do you think there is a case here that could build itself into a much larger campaign, something like what George W. Bush did with AIDS in Africa or Ebola in 2014? Do you think that kind of international solidarity could actually come in and say, here we have a subcontinent that is suffering, that is potentially looking dangerous for the rest of the world. Let's get in there and really help solve this.
mean, that would be ideal. But unfortunately, the state of the world and the world order right now is not conducive to multilateralism. And certainly, ideally, you would have an effort led by the United States to put together that type of consensus, that type of coalition, to take major steps that can once and for all tackle this pandemic in a big and lasting way. But I think given what's happened in the world over the last 4 years, the US under the Trump administration was not really the global leader that it had been. And the Biden administration is trying to return to that, but it's still focused on getting its own house in order, which I think could be one of the reasons why the US was slow to respond this time. And the US government continues to be very concerned about the pandemic in the US, even though it has turned the corner. Acknowledgement, there's a lot of unpredictability and volatility about the pandemic, concern about needing to ensure there's enough vaccines for potential booster shots. A number of these vaccines are going to need third doses, and so on. And then there's the economy, which has strengthened in the U.S., but I think the administration is still focused on that. So I think that in time, we may see the Biden administration step up to the plate globally to try to work with like-minded partners. And you have baked in advantages such as the Quad, for example, which is there, and it's clear that those 4 countries are willing to step up. And even before this horrific surge played out in India, you had that meeting of top Quad leaders where they decided one of their first initiatives related to the pandemic, and it was meant in part to strengthen India's capacities to manufacture more vaccines. So that could be a start. But I think that given the fact that the 2 most powerful countries in the world right now are not at each other's throats, but pretty close to it, that's, I think, going to make it difficult to build the type of broader consensus that you really need. I mean, you need the US and China to be willing to cooperate more. And you need those 2 countries to be getting along better in order to have a broader, more lasting multilateral arrangement to push forward with, initiatives meant to tackle the pandemic, things like that. There have been efforts over the last few years outside of the U.S. and China to generate multilateral initiatives. Europe, there is an initiative led by the German foreign minister that brought together some countries to try to strengthen multilateralism. But there's only so far you can go if you don't have the US and China on board those types of initiatives. So I'm skeptical about the immediate term. I hope that in due course, once the US is ready to look more outward after it concludes that its own house is in order, that at that point we'll be able to focus more on these multilateral global efforts. But I think that will take some time.
My understanding is that India has not yet reached out to the US in terms of requesting for excess vaccine supplies to be sent here, Michael. And I know that there's many other countries in the line that have made that request. Do you see that likely as happening? Could there be that kind of direct support in terms of shipping vaccines here?
Well, I mean, I think the immediate need is oxygen, materials and other things like that, aside from vaccines. But indeed, in due course, I think India is in a position where it's going to need more capacity to produce vaccines, the raw materials and all that, but also vaccines themselves. And, obviously it's been a major controversy in the United States that, there are limitations as to exactly what the US can do with shipping surplus vaccines abroad. The Trump administration had signed an agreement with US vaccine manufacturers during the last few months of its term in which it agreed not to send any vaccines overseas, mainly because of these vaccine producers' concerns about liability if vaccines were to go overseas. But certainly there are workarounds, and the main area to look at is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which there's plenty of those here in the US, but they have not been cleared for official use, meaning they're not tied to these regulations about exporting. So there's no reason why the US cannot send all these AstraZeneca vaccines lying around overseas, including to India. There are some other workarounds that can be looked at, such as by sending some vaccines to other countries and characterizing them as loans, not as actual exports. That could allow the US to get around some of the language that restricts the export of vaccines. So there's no reason why the US shouldn't be able to export vaccines to India. But my sense is that for India, one of the major hopes would be to get more capacity to produce vaccines itself. I think that's quite clear because India, it seems easy to forget right now, given what he's going through. But just a few months ago, India rolled out what I believe was the very first national mass vaccination campaign. It has the capacity to produce vaccines. It produces 50, 60% of the vaccines in total worldwide. So it has the capacity to do so. Certainly in the immediate term, given how dire the situation is in India, some type of ability to acquire vaccines themselves in the short term would be ideal. But I think here we see what Russia is doing to assist. There could be other countries that try to step up to the plate to provide vaccines. So I think in terms of India's main asks of the United States right now, vaccines themselves don't need to be the main priority. I think the bigger priority is the supplies that I mentioned earlier, oxygen tanks, other things like that, as well as raw materials for vaccines. And the good news is that over the last day or two, last few days, many senior U.S. officials have said that those will be the types of things that will be sent to India. So hope is on the way, help is on the way from the United States to India. Some would have preferred that it be announced or at least telegraphed earlier, but that type of help is on the way.
So is hope, Michael. At this point, that's all we've got. You started this conversation by pointing out that the reason, or one of the reasons people were quite concerned, was because of India's own stature as an emerging power, as a large economic power to deal with. Let me ask you candidly whether you think the events of the last month or so have dented that, because India has always enjoyed a lot of goodwill globally. But here you have a situation where it's careening down a slope that no one knows, where it's going to end. On the point of vaccines, like you said, there's also been a sharp drop in the export of vaccines that were promised to other low-income countries by Serum Institute themselves, the AstraZeneca vaccine. Has India lost its stature in the last month, and why do you think that's happened, if you do agree?
No, I don't think that it's lost its that stature, so to speak. I think that there is just a very strong consensus, a strong global consensus in support of this idea that India is a critically important country, that it can't fail, that the world needs to do what it can to get India back on track. And as we discussed before, there are some concerns from many countries about the government in India and its response to the pandemic, but that is not going to make the world unwilling to want to help India. I think that the very importance that the world ascribes to India is going to ensure that in due course you will have efforts to bring more assistance to India. And certainly, it's hard to make a prediction now as what the ultimate impact of this pandemic will be on India, on its economy, and its ability to play a role in the world. It's hard to say, but it's nothing if not resilient. And we saw how India managed to ride out the first wave of the pandemic last year. Its economy was showing some pretty significant signs of recovery over the last few months, and so I think that it certainly has the ability to bounce back, but it's hard to talk about the here and now just because we don't know how much worse it can get in India before things get better. But I think that the health, one thing that will be clear from this pandemic is that despite how much progress India has made, growing itself out as a major contributor to world affairs and its economic growth, and these industries coming out of India, you still have major areas of concern, including the health infrastructure. And that was known before the pandemic, for sure. But I think that the pandemic will make it even more clear how much work there is still to be done. And certainly there are some analysts, observers that believe that India's aspirations of becoming a world power are sort of naive in the sense that India still has so much more it needs to do at home, such as reducing poverty, for example, strengthening the education system, and boosting its health infrastructure, that it's not yet ready to play that role in the world stage. Now, that's a controversial point. Others would say, no, not at all. You could do both. You could be building up your economy while you interact with the world. And in fact, more engagement with the world can strengthen your economy. There's something to be said for that. But bottom line here is that, I think that it is certainly clear that as far as India wants to go, despite these very strong and ambitious goals that the Indian government and the Indian state have in terms of what role they can play in the world, there's still a lot more work to be done at home. And indeed, no matter how this plays out with the pandemic now, there's going to need to be a lot of soul searching, I think, about how to make the health infrastructure more resilient and fortify it to be in a better position to withstand the types of shocks that the country has experienced over the last few weeks.
One final question, Michael. As you pointed out, and as has been recorded by many local reporters as well, there seems to be a big gap in terms of the data that is being put out at this point, whether it's in the number of active cases or the deaths. And this is a problem that India has been struggling with for some years now, the fact that data transparency has been questioned. Do you think there might be, at this juncture, more global pressure on India to come out and be more transparent about its data because there is aid and rescue efforts that are tied in with that? Do you think India will now be asked to be more accountable about what exactly is happening?
I think so. I don't think that will be an initial objective of the international community. I think the initial objectives are to focus on getting people healthy again and try to ensure that you don't have more deaths than you've already had, regardless of whether the numbers are underreported or not. But indeed, absolutely, I think that this notion of data collection and record keeping, this is something that's long been a challenge, not just in India, but in the broader region. I mean, this is something that Pakistan has struggled with as well. And indeed, I do think that eventually this will be something that needs to be looked at a lot more. But again, I just don't see it as an initial goal. Maybe after India's turned the corner, and when there's efforts to try to figure out how to plan for future pandemics and how the world can plan for its own capacity to assist India if it needs assistance when you have future pandemics like this, that's when the conversations will have to begin about how India can improve its record keeping and data tallying capacities to ensure that you have proper recordings of deaths. But of course, this is a political issue as well, right? One could argue, or a skeptic could argue, that maybe the government would prefer that the full extent of death tolls is not known. I think that's something that a skeptic would put out there as a possibility in order to minimize the perception that things are out of control and that the death tolls is completely out of control. So that's, again, it's a skeptical take, but I think that's an important point to put on the table too.
It's been fantastic chatting with you, Michael, and I hope we speak again in better times, for us at least. But thank you very much for taking time out and speaking with me today.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.